everyone. I'm Stephen Robinson, the play typer guy. Today, I am very happy to have my friend and Wonkette colleague, Michael Mora, on to discuss the subway vigilante killing. You had written recently about Daniel Penny, the man who killed Jordan Neely on a New York subway a few weeks back. And the Wonkette article, which is going to be linked below and people should read, I found very compelling because you discussed what had occurred from your perspective as a trained former Marine. And I've seen a lot of where Penny's background as a Marine is sort of used to sort of exonerate him, as if it's exculpatory, as opposed to actually, in my view, and I think yours, damning, because he should have known better. Do you mind walking us through what your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so for me, it was, reading initially the reports, the main thing that I found that were like black and white for me was that Jordan Neely, by most accounts, at most, was disruptive. He was maybe loud. Maybe he was yelling about, I believe, that he was hungry, that he was tired, and that he was just not wanting to, he couldn't take it anymore. And he threw his jacket on the ground. At no point has anybody from the actual reports of the witnesses that were there or from any of the reports of what happened has stated that Jordan Neely attacked anybody in that occasion at that day. People are trying to conflate about, oh, well, Jordan Neely, approached somebody, and there's a video of him like being very aggressive towards somebody else at a previous instance. But to me, it's like, but that doesn't count. Like, Daniel Penny doesn't have clairvoyance or a computer memory at the time for him to know Jordan Neely's entire history before he decided to take action. So we can only base Daniel Penny's actions on what happened that day. And that day, Jordan Neely was just being loud, and he decided to use force that was excessive in order to subdue Jordan Neely. And for me, the thing that keeps getting brought up is they keep bringing up his military background and that he's a Marine vet and all that. And it's like you said, they're using it in an exculpatory manner to kind of like shield him from being held accountable. When to me, as a Marine vet, it tells me that he should have known better to be able to assess what's going on, determine what kind of force, if necessary, and then if he needed to apply force, what the proper application of force is. And none of those three things happened. He decided to put Jordan Neely in a rear naked choke for what I read was about, what was it, like 7 minutes, something like that. And the person who caught the video only missed about 3 to 4 minutes of the actual incident. So what we saw was, after 3 or 4 minutes of already having Jordan Neely on the ground in a rear naked choke, we saw the very end of it, and Jordan Neely basically died.
Yeah, and what you were saying earlier, again, no evidence of him. People might have felt threatened, and I think anyone who's been on a subway car, I don't want to dehumanize, and I always clarify this, I don't want to dehumanize the homeless or people who present as mentally ill, but it can be like a wild, like uncertain what's going to happen when you're around a wild animal or something, and it's like, oh no, what could happen or what could go on. But that's very different from someone literally starting something, which is ironic. I mean, I lived in New York for 15 years during the most of the Giuliani administration, and then I think the first 200 years of the Bloomberg era. And there was if you went to any bar, you would see bar fights. And so this wasn't like Neely, like the two of us, like two guys getting in a drunken fight. One guy pushes the other, and the other guy cracks his skull, which is still manslaughter.
Right.
It is what I have witnessed, especially with my female friends, with someone being aggressive, not even sort of that, but like really like, okay, what you're saying to her is really scary and uncool, some drunken Wall Street douchebag, frankly.
Right.
And you just you walk away. So
Right.
you remove yourself from the incident, and or you just a bouncer removes them. But there are no stories of bouncers routinely killing drunken douchebags.
Right.
And so it just felt as if what's happening, especially from the right, is that Neely, it is the fact that he is homeless. He is an unperson. He is not sort of people in similar situations. And again, a subway car, having ridden a subway with a lot of unwell people at times, someone who literally defecated on the subway, a woman who was starting to take her clothes off on the subway. Everyone has these stories. We
Right.
don't routinely kill these people. We either just leave. It's not an airplane. You're not on an airplane for 6 hours. You're able to just leave. You can leave after a few minutes. And every weird subway story I have, they're weird subway stories, but someone being choked to death in front of me to the point that they are defecating, because I think that happened towards the end of Neely's life, would traumatize me permanently. Like what Penny did is more traumatic than Neely is like any number of people I've encountered in New York and just went to the opposite end of the train. Or there was always in Washington, they used to call it Washington Square Park. Square Park, there's always the guys who got to crazy, yelling religion and so forth. I remember I was, this was not yet living in New York. I was a college student and was in New York on a trip. And this guy comes up and is like, "Hey man, do you want to buy some of the hottest shit imaginable?" I'm like, "No, and he puts his hand out and it's literally human feces in his hand.
Literally the hottest shit. I mean, you can't get them for false advertisement. It's literally the hottest shit around.
And you have but so much of that was coming at you.
Yeah.
And that's New York. I've gone on about this, of how there's a generation of, frankly, white suburban people who grew up watching Friends or How I Met Your Mother, and like, well, this is what my New York experience should be like. There's no poor people around. I live in a village of no queer people or no minorities, and that's what's going on. Like, no.
It's able to sit in the Central Perk couch for like hours on end while only buying one cup of coffee, and no one has an issue with that.
Yes.
Park yourself in the main couch in the middle of the coffee shop, and nobody has an issue, including the coffee shop.
Nikki Haley said that Kathy Hochul should immediately pardon Penny, because, and as a Marine, Penny just had this urge to help people. And you'd written about how people have started calling him a good Samaritan, which is not actually how that story works.
I like the entire story of the Good Samaritan biblically is that a guy is on the side of the road and he's dying, and the Samaritan takes pity on him and like nurses his wounds and takes him to an inn and tells the person at the inn to take care of him and make sure that he's fed and taken care of, and I will take care of, and pay for everything. At no point does he choke the person out at all or even exert any violence. Like the entire point of the story is that he just takes care of his fellow human being. And it was, I believe it was like a parable basically saying, where Jesus was basically saying, hey, be like that guy and take care of your fellow human being. Again, at no point did Daniel Penny take care of his fellow human being when he choked Jordan Neely. And the thing that's astounding to me is that every single person has been in a public space, public transit, any type of, area where you've seen crazy shit going on. You have seen it. And even in your example where you see somebody acting erratically and you just decide, okay, I'm going to move to another cart. That is you assessing the situation, deciding what the next course of action, and then taking the proper course of action by removing yourself from the situation. Again, at any point, Daniel Penny could have done that. If
Mm-hmm.
Jordan Neely at any point had actually physically attacked somebody, and at that point, Daniel Penny had reacted to subdue Jordan Neely because Jordan Neely had attacked someone, kind of like as a protective thing, I think we'd be having a different conversation. Even though it would still be manslaughter,
Mm-hmm.
the entire defense of like it was self defense or he was being, he was protecting someone would be more apt. But there's no one saying that that happened, and it's astounding to me the way that pundits and people online and just this shouldn't be political, but politic, politicians are twisting themselves into pretzels to create a situation where they can then excuse Daniel Penny's actions.
Mm-hmm.
So, well, what if you get attacked? Yeah, okay. What if you get attacked and you defend yourself? But that's not what happened here.
Yeah.
But
Well,
but
we talked
what?
about his criminal record, which often is just his being homeless, because you're going to be, I mean, what they want is to criminalize homelessness and sort of like you're loitering, you're here. So if you're homeless for any extended amount of time, you're going to have a record. There was an incident of violence regarding he punched someone, but again, that's punching someone,
Mhm.
and that's a prior bad act. Like
Right.
you could even bring that into trial if Neely was on trial for a crime. It's like because that's not relevant to this instance, as
Right.
you said. Um, Penny had no awareness of anything about Neely's background, literally, other than, and you can't just sort of, oh, how fortunate. I think the sort of legal thought crime that comes up is like um, a, a drunk driver running a stop sign, hitting a guy, is still on the hook for the crime in that moment. It doesn't matter if it's later revealed that that guy was on his way to shoot up a school. So it's kind of like, oh, well, that's fortunate, but they
Right.
don't actually now say, oh, that's
Yeah.
no longer manslaughter, and here's the key to the city. It's no, you didn't know this was happening. If you did, you had evidence of that,
Mm-hmm.
that's a different dialogue and different
Which would be
discussion.
quite tenuous. I mean, we don't live in a minority report society where we have pre-crime. Like there's no precogs who like predict the future and can tell you exactly what the crime was going to be, and we don't have a special department that stops crimes before they happen and can do that
Yes.
for certainty. Like, when people talk about police preventing crimes, they talk about police being a presence that then deters quote unquote crime from happening. But in reality, they can't prevent something from happening. That's
Oh
because
yeah.
you can't prove a negative. So the only thing they can do is after the fact react to it and then enforce. And that's if police departments are all doing the right thing, which is a questionable thing to begin with.
Well, so the best case scenario would be, let's say you throw so much money for cops in New
Sure.
York, and there's 4 cops on every subway car, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, my brother-in-law is a police officer. He had used to work on patrol. He has, I'm sure, subdued a number of people having mental health episodes or just outright violent people. He has never killed anyone. I mean, the idea is that you subdue them. So it's sort of like, even if he was a cop and had law enforcement agency, there's a sense of, okay, well, subduing should not be killing. Like there's no, and often isn't the argument usually like, okay, well,
subduing
when
should be like
that's like he's reached for my gun or he's done something that leads to a
that's
fear.
usually what happens after someone's already died. All of a sudden, they
Yeah.
magically always reach for the gun. But the subduing is already at that point is technically like step 3, because step 1 should be de-escalation of the situation. So
Mhm.
police officers should be in the ideal world, should be trained to de-escalate a situation and handle it that way. Then they should be trained to, at that point, let the person know what the consequences are if they do not de-escalate themselves, and let them know. Usually people, when they can't be talked down and then realize what the consequences are, you're going to be arrested, you're going to be detained, you're going to be charged, they usually then back away. And then three is this person ignored the other two steps, and now they're being physically violent, and now you have to subdue.
Yeah,
At
well,
no point
it's
are any of those supposed to be lethal.
well de-escalation. Going back to the bouncers, or anytime you've been in a nightclub, I don't know if you have been in nightclubs and so forth,
Okay.
but it's like the guy shows up and the scrawny dude, the guy being obnoxious or even drunken, the bounce usually like, okay, look, take it outside,
Right.
don't finish your drink, leave. Let's just de-escalate. It's like it's not violent yet, and then if you, but there's the understanding because this very large guy is saying, "Please leave," and if that doesn't happen, then they sort of move. Then it kind of keeps. There's an old X-Files episode I was watching recently of where Mulder is being drugged, so he's sort of an LSD, so he's kind of very erratic. So erratic, he takes a swing at Skinner, who very much Marine had built, and it's not even a fight. I mean, drugged out Mulder does the best he can, but Skinner grabs him, sort of kind of chokehold, and it's like, "We done?" Because but he doesn't choke the laugh at him. It's just basically, "We done?"
Like there's I've talked, after writing the article and just having to have this conversation online, I've heard from people who like are bouncers. Like there's a million ways that you can put somebody in a restraint hold that is not a rear naked choke, which in essence, I mean, it's a move to subdue, but you get taught this move to basically like stop whoever it is as quickly as possible. And sometimes stopping whoever it is as quickly as possible means just killing them. Because if you're learning it in Marine Corps martial arts training, or McMAP, the whole point is that this is the situation where you have no gun, you may not have a knife, you are now stuck on the ground with someone who is intent on killing you because you're in a war situation, and your entire training is to be able to subdue that person so that then you can live and move on with the fight if need be. It's not meant for you to like, gently let them out of the room and let them go somewhere. It's just, this is like, in case of emergency, this is what you do. You get stuck in a grapple situation, this is what you do. This is why MMA fighters learn rear naked chokes and things like that. Usually when that happens in an MMA fight, the boxing has ended, the kicking has ended, and both fighters are on the ground. And at that point, one fighter is trying to subdue the other fighter, and the other fighter is trying to prevent themselves from getting subdued. So that's the type of situation you're talking about. In the Jordan Neely situation, from what I've read in most reports, Jordan Neely was standing, and then Daniel Penny applied a rear naked choke. At no point did he might not have even known that anything was going to happen with his back turned when Daniel Penny applied a rear naked choke. And at that point, it's fight or flight, and you're going to try to defend yourself. And that's why in the footage that we've seen, there's at least two other passengers who are either trying to hold his legs or keep him from kicking, while Daniel Penny's still applying the rear naked choke on him. Which, the effectiveness of it, and this is something that I mentioned almost immediately in a chat with you and with Robin and everything, is that a rear naked choke is a blood choke. So you cut out the blood in your carotid arteries and your neck, and that makes you go unconscious. If applied properly, it takes 8 to 13 seconds for a person to pass out. When I've done it in training, as soon as it comes on, you feel it. Daniel Penny probably sucked at putting it on, so let's go ahead and just give him the benefit that he didn't put it on properly. Still, like 7 minutes of having a rear naked choke on somebody, like you went way above and beyond, including the fact that, like we mentioned, the footage shows that there were two other passengers who did help with moving his arms and legs, so that he could have been let go and could have been restrained with between three different passengers going. This had every way of not ending up in a lethal situation.
And despite, Ron DeSantis, of course, supported Penny and said vets support vets and did this whole thing of trying to raise. Penny has raised about $2 million for his defense. Yeah. But, despite all these attacks about these quote unquote source funded prosecutors and all the sort of dog whistling there, it seems as if the DA is giving him the benefit of the doubt. They're not presuming a premeditated murder, like an intent to kill him. It's what you described, that he is pretty bad at the choke. Like he might have imagined himself being Skinner. Going,
the fact that he was
done, but Neely it wasn't done.
Yeah, the fact that Neely was kicking, even in the footage that we saw, which was 3 to 4 minutes in, means that he wasn't passed out at 8 to 13 seconds or 2 to 5 minutes if you're doing an air choke, like a regular strangulation. So the fact that he was still like kicking and fighting means that he was still conscious enough at that point. So to me, it tells me that he didn't apply it properly, but he still is applying a rear naked choke on a person who is unarmed and probably didn't see it coming, and with the help of 2 other passengers, and kept going until the point where Neely died. Like that.
Well, yeah, and it just sort of changes. And again, everyone wants to talk about, and with wrong statistics, that crime is rampant in New York, and it's usually like situations where like single digit offense, is now double digit, so it looks like it's been
but then
50, but it's not that case. But like what they're describing makes what Neely was doing is so many, again, in the good old Giuliani days, what was described of what Neely was doing was something I would encounter at least 3 or 4 times a week, riding on the subway. Again, in the Giuliani days, when that's supposed to be the golden age of New York from right-wingers. Right. And what Penny did is something I never saw, because I would be horrified. I would never forget that. So that's the escalation. So the idea that you're just going to just kill any home. If the person having a mental health episode, person being strange is, and, to the point that there's jokes about in New York. Again, as a first-time New Yorker, there's always a time of where you're like, oh, wow, it's rush hour and all these packed cars. Look, there's a car that's coming in that seems empty. I don't know why these suckers are in the packed car. I'm going to get on this empty car and put my feet up. It's like, oh, crap, the door's closed and there's someone ranting at you, or has like a power, like there's all these incidents. And the idea that you'd have these vigilantes on there killing these people is horrifying and scary. And it seems like folks want this. And I guess this goes back to, as people who read comics, read superhero stuff. There's always been, I mentioned in the past chat of how, unfortunately, you can go back to Zorro, which is good, or you can go back to Birth of a Nation, which is the idea of the first costumed superhero story, costumed crime fighter. It's like it's a rich guy, white guy, the black people are taking over. He puts on his costume to hide his identity, which is the Klan, and he goes and kicks butt. And there's that sense of people wanting that, especially in the 80s. So the Miller comics was the idea that, as opposed to the Adam West Batman, where it's a bunch of cops who can't solve a riddle. It's okay, well, we can't solve this riddle. We're going to go to the smart detective and his teenager partner who's going to solve the riddle. Here it's more of like the criminals, the law serves the criminals. So we need someone outside the law to, in year 1, where Batman literally threatens to kill someone unless he testifies, certain things like that creates that sense of the vigilantism that we're starting to see now, that people sort of want to see this. Though what Penny did was kind of like unstable Red Hood type stuff of like literally killing someone, as opposed to, we've talked about this, of where a lot of what Batman does, where his would essentially probably kill someone. You land 200 pounds from landing on a 100-pound junkie is not going to be good for that junkie.
Be bad for that. Bad day. I've seen The Dark Knight. I saw how Batman landed on a van, and the van just crushed. So I would hate to be like a 90-pound junkie and have that land on me. That would
No, no,
probably be the end of the day.
he's probably crippled people, whatever. But the fantasy there is that Batman
Sure.
doesn't kill. Like, so despite he's roughing people up, but he's not
Right.
killing anyone, and certainly not so unprofessionally.
Mm-hmm.
Like, if he gives the chokehold, he knows. I think
Yeah.
I was reading like Court of Owls or something. I'm sorry if you're tuning in, you're going to be a comic book fan.
Yeah.
Reading the Scott Snyder's Court of Owls, and there's one
Right.
scene where Batman has someone in a chokehold, and he's like, he knows the exact, as you said, the exact amount of time. It's gone past that. Something must be up with this guy. And he releases it enough to then deduce that it's like not a human or something, and it goes to a different. But
Yeah.
again, he was always very aware and very clear that he's not going to just
And
murder someone.
In the Batman comics, it's all in the dialogue. Like, he will explain, this is exactly how much pressure you need to apply to do X, Y, and Z. This is exactly how much time you need to hold your breath to be underwater so that you're presumed dead, but you're not really dead. So you can come out of the water and then catch them by surprise. But that's like part of that is the evolution of comics, where it began with, the adventure tales of, like, swashbuckling heroes, like Zorro, Scarlet Pimpernel, things like that. And even Sherlock Holmes, where he was a consulting detective, but he didn't work for the police. The police would come to him for help, but the whole point was the police was inept and couldn't solve crimes. So they had to consult a detective on the side who would do it. Same thing, with Zorro, it was the Spanish government was corrupt, so he was fighting for the people. And it was this whole thing. So somewhere around the 80s, it became this thing where it's kind of that Reagan mantra where I'm from the government and I'm here to help is like the worst thing that you can be. So it was all this about creating an opportunity where anybody who wasn't directly affiliated with the government was the real heroes, or anybody who went outside the law was the hero. So that's when you had your Dirty Harry, you had Batman become more fascistic and militarized, but in a weird way, they were also pro cop. So it was this weird thing where Batman became more of a cop instead of being more of a detective in the 80s.
He's just a cop who can dangle a junkie outside of it.
He's a cop who's not bound by the rules of civil liberties. In fact, I remember watching a documentary about comics, and writer Larry Hama even made that thing. They're called superheroes, not what is it? Due process heroes.
Mm-hmm.
So they don't follow due process. So from the extent of vigilantism, like, yeah, it's vicarious fun, but you're not supposed to emulate them. And Daniel Penny wasn't emulating any superhero. The closest he would be emulating would be someone like the Punisher, and even the Punisher would not kill a random innocent person just cause. Like that.
No, he was usually killing drug dealers and so forth, and he was written as a bad guy that people like Daredevil and Spider-Man would stop. But now, I mean, he was a vet, so DeSantis and Nikki Haley be wearing Punisher T-shirts and be all pro.
Of course.
And there inevitably and that was also a constant theme in comics and the cartoons. At some point, there would be the person who's worse, than Batman, like who's actually killing people or whatever. And there's usually some politician or people gets behind that guy, like or whatever. And then it's revealed that this person's a complete psychotic, and that's not something you should be, emulating. It's, but yes, it's disturbing the degree of essentially like this had to have like his Taxi Driver, like someone stood up, and
it's
obviously
disturbing and not surprising, which is the sad part for me, because it's this thing where you see it escalating every year when you have these incidents happen of people essentially getting away with violating the law and then being like lionized by the right wing, to the point where it's not surprising that right wing media and politicians all of a sudden flock to Daniel Penny when they've already flocked to George Zimmerman when he killed Trayvon Martin. They flocked to Kyle Rittenhouse when he killed two people. Like Daniel Penny is just the next in the line of people who like got to live the vicarious fantasy that they all want of being able to kill people who they disagree with and get
Mm-hmm.
away with it under a justification. Because you saw it with it's the same thing we saw with Trayvon Martin. As soon as he was killed, all of a sudden it was like, well, he skipped school and he smoked weed once and all this. It's like I've told people that all it takes is for you to be killed by a right wing killer, and trust me, the first thing that will happen is no matter how good you are, they will dig to every mistake you've ever made and put them on blast to say that's
Mm-hmm.
okay and this is why you deserve to die. Same thing with Kyle Rittenhouse. The two people that he killed and maimed, all of a sudden we're hearing about their records and their criminal history, which in one of the cases I think was very heinous. But at the same time, like Kyle Rittenhouse didn't know that when he shot them, he didn't have like a RoboCop scope that came up and told him the entire police record before he shot these people. He just took action and shot people because he decided to come to a protest that was peaceful with a weapon, which escalated the situation. And then two people died. Well, same thing with Daniel Penny. Like you mentioned, he didn't know Jordan Neely's record, and there's no way he could have known. So despite the fact that he looks like Finn Jones, the actor who played Iron Fist in that Netflix show, that doesn't mean he was Iron Fist, and that doesn't mean that he was justified killing somebody. And this thing where the media, and it's usually right wing media, goes out of their way to smear the victim of a crime while somehow whitewashing the person who did the crime. When it's in these instances of like a right wing person that they basically want to lionize and make a hero out of, it's just disappointing and yet predictable because it happens all the time. As soon as Jordan Neely died, his body hadn't reached the morgue yet, and we already knew how many crimes and how many things he had done previously, which is why it was okay that he was murdered. And then Daniel Penny, all we knew was, first he was anonymous, so we didn't know anything about him. He had to be basically tracked down by the entire internet to then find out, oh, well, he was a Marine vet. And then we only know so much. We know his military record, and it's a very basic record. In fact, in the piece that I wrote, I mentioned the similarities that he and I have as far as like on paper what our records look like. One enlistment, deployed once, were stationed overseas, left as a corporal, got promoted to sergeant while in inactive reserve, and then that's it. I don't know what his MOS was, what it was, but I do know that based on his record and based on the fact that all Marines take very basic training that is recurrent every year, I know he had to go to the rifle range every year. I know he had to do his physical fitness tests every year to qualify. And I know he had to go to the Marine Corps martial arts program every year to requalify at least once a year. He could go more than once a year if he wanted to, get a higher belt. Like, there's a tan belt that's the lowest belt, and I had like a gray belt. So I went multiple times, but he had to at least gone once every year. So for the 4 years that he served, he had a recurrent training on how to apply these moves, when not to apply these moves, and what the conditions are for you to use this force. And he still abused that, and now someone is dead, whether accidental or on purpose. And I'm going to skew that he didn't mean to kill Jordan Neely, because I don't know for sure more about Daniel Penny's like motivation at that
Yeah,
time. I do know
but
that he
he
didn't.
assaulted him. He laid hands on him, and to me, it's
I
like
know.
you assaulted.
Yeah.
If you assaulted someone, you need to explain why you laid hands
Right.
on someone. So if you were to grab me from behind, it needs to be something other than I'm
Sure.
obnoxious. That's not enough.
Sure.
That's not
Of
enough.
course.
And sort of the idea that essentially, otherwise, it's going to feel as if it's a murder based on his class. He is homeless. He presents as much. He is mentally ill. As people say, so crazy. I've seen that term you thrown around and print, even in the New York Times. And so that means he is dangerous. And you know, it's the whole thing
Well,
with the
that's
somewhat
another problem where the media and especially right wing media has made it where it's okay to be violent and cruel to these undesirables. So if you're
mhm.
homeless, if you're mentally ill, it's okay. We can be cruel to you and even kill you because we're justified in
Oh
doing
yeah,
so because you are undesirable, which is why, Tucker, rest in peace to his show, constantly would talk about the homeless situation in, San Francisco or California or, San Francisco, California, but he would talk about San Francisco specifically, California in general, um, or the homelessness in New York and the subways and things like that. This is an escalation that they've they've kept going in the media
hmm
to create this situation where people don't see people who are homeless or may have mental health issues as human beings. They've dehumanized them,
it's yeah, it's
and
a sort of classic authoritarianism because these same people, and Trump did it very recently, are still calling a black law enforcement officer a thug
Mhm.
for shooting Ashley Babbitt, a white woman, literally breaking into the Capitol. Not even breaking into a Walgreens, because everyone freaks out when that happens, you know, somewhat rightly,
Right.
obviously, during riots. But she's not breaking into a Walgreens. She's breaking into the US Capitol. A black cop is saying, stand down, stop, don't come further. Pretty much textbook, like, good shot. And she's being martyred, and they're not hiding it. I mean, there was a period where some law and order Republicans were consistent, so they would be
Mhm.
sort of, okay, the law is what it is, and
Right.
so and to have order, we can't have this, we can't have vigilantism, and we can't have people, you know, breaking it, no matter who you are. We can't have
Right.
riots, but it's an across the board type thing. And then here it's just an escalation of pure authoritarianism, and that kind of when you're talking about Penny and your similarities. Um, you know, he had served, and you had served as well, right? You were
Mhm.
in Iraq, and for how long
Yeah.
was that?
So I served from 2000 to 2005, and I was stationed in Ali Al Salim Air Base in Kuwait prior to Operation Iraqi Freedom in 2003, and then I was there through the entire actual, you know, Operation Iraqi Freedom um, timetable, and then I was there just a little bit after, a few months after the whole mission accomplished banner and everything. Um, and then I came home, and then shortly after I came home was when the insurgents began, and then that kept going, and then that was where, even though Operation Iraqi Freedom ended, there was technically an Operation Iraqi Freedom 2, and then there was, the insurgency that kept going, and you know I was supposed to deploy again, but thankfully there was not a stopgap at that point, so I was able to, when my enlistment ended, if I didn't want to, I I met the terms of my service, so I was able to leave at that point. I was also supposed to be stationed in Okinawa, but I never made that.
But you voluntarily enlisted, and if I'm understanding the timeline, though, this is after 9/11,
No, it was
the
before.
before 9/11, but
So
that
I
you had
so
enlisted.
so I joined the Marine Corps in August 2000. Well,
No,
I went to boot camp in August 2000. So I was in Pensacola, Florida, in one of my schools, and I was studying for the final exam before then going to California for my second school of my training. I had a lot of training that year when 9/11 happened. So I almost didn't get to graduate. And even when I graduated, we were supposedly going to be sent on a military aircraft directly to our second school and not have any time to go visit family or any leave, because at that point we were in this mentality that we were in imminent war situation. But that de-escalated, and then it became the ramp up to the actual war with all this stuff that you're familiar with Colin Powell and the UN and all this. We knew we were going to war prior. I was already in Ali Al Salim Air Base in February of 2003, and we hadn't technically officially announced that we were going to be going to war until what, March or April. was when the first shots started happening. So we were there like way in advance. So while the news media was reporting like we're still, possibly, maybe, we're not sure, I'm sitting in a desert like sweating, going, yeah, we're going. Well, I'm pretty sure this is happening. Um,
uh, and
but yeah,
obviously
I
to
enlisted
state.
before. I thought my enlistment was going to be quick. It was going to be simple peacetime enlistment. It
Mhm.
was a year in when all of a sudden I realized, yeah, your enlistment's not going to go as smoothly as you thought it was going to go.
Yeah, because I had family. I'm a little older than you, and I have family a little older than myself, and
Hmm.
they didn't. This is not to diminish their service, whatever, but there was a sense of this is peacetime service,
Sure.
which is very different from. That story is always sort of compelling to me at folks like you who'd gone in and uh, because not to state the obvious, this is very dangerous.
Yeah.
It is a war. You're at
Hmm.
war, and so yeah. I mean, it's
I mean, during peacetime, you have deployments like normal. You could be on a ship, and you're just on a routine, deployment, or if it's like something like Okinawa, it's basically like a second duty station. So you're just doing what your regular job is, just in Okinawa, Japan, versus Camp Pendleton, California, where I was. Um,
mhm.
Obviously, that changes exponentially when there's a war or whenever there's a conflict. Because there's people who joined during peacetime during the Clinton years, and all of a sudden they're on the ship that all of a sudden gets told you're going to Kosovo and you're going to have some type of engagement that you weren't planning on. So there was always something that you could put your life at risk. But yeah, there is this sense that when you join in these times that are quote unquote peace times, you're like, okay, well, I could still, die, and I could still go on a deployment, and I could still, something happens, but you're not fully expecting that that's what's going to happen.
Mhm.
When something like 9/11 happens, and then when the ramp up to Iraq happens, you're for sure know what's going to happen. And then after Iraq happened, and or Afghanistan and then Iraq, and those two things are going on simultaneously, during the entire time of your enlistment for the most part, you're pretty sure that at any point you could actually deploy, and you're actually putting your life at risk more than, say, you know, prior to 2000, serving in the exact same thing, and you're just repairing electronic equipment on a helicopter
Yeah.
in Camp Pendleton and just having what's essentially a college dorm life. You know,
Yeah, it's as someone, of course, is a big fan of the film and play. A Few Could Have Been. I always remember the line from Kiefer Sutherland's character of like, "Oh, you Navy boys are all right. Whenever we need to go somewhere to fight, you give us a ride." But
yeah, that's the
uh,
that's the in, that's those little intro jokes about the military that you have. You have the Marine Corps calling the Navy their taxis,
mhm.
and you have everyone calling the Air Force the chair force, and how if we all go to war, they're the ones who have to make sure that the room is carpeted and fully air conditioned. Um, there's that joke about a general says secure the building, and the Air Force buys a 20-year lease. The Army sets up a plan and takes forever to execute. What is it? The Navy is still arguing about how to paint everything white on the outside, and the Marine Corps just demolishes the building to rubble. They all had the same order, but they all handled it in different ways.
And so it's interesting of how in military backgrounds in comics as well, because
Hmm.
for the recent Batwoman TV series, the
Hmm.
Kathy, the backstory was she was um, in the military, and that explains her training. As opposed to, I mean, there was that period of where a lot of Batman's training is sort of the idea like it's sort of this Far East ninja type like stuff where, as opposed to perhaps the more straightforward thing would have been him just joining like the
Well,
Marines or something.
he was a billionaire playboy. Why would he join the military?
Well,
He
for
has
the
all the
type of training, so yes, he could just go and
yeah.
do the more. It's
The Bruce Wayne training to me was always the way I saw it was the Kane and Kung Fu. He just like for several years just travels the earth and just finds the expert at whatever he wants to learn, and then he has to learn how to be a master escape artist from Zatanna's dad, Zatara, and then he has to learn the ways of the ninja in the Far East, and then he has to
Mhm.
learn tracking from Henry Ducard,
Yeah.
and he just would just travel the world as unknown as possible, learn all these skills, then put them all together. And that's not to include that in some earlier comics, he actually went to college and studied like criminology. So somewhere there's a background where like this rich playboy like just went to college to study criminology and nobody asked questions why, you know.
he yeah, but yes, there's sort of that degree of expert in everything
Mhm.
type of backstory for him.
Yeah, for some heroes,
Um,
it's just faster to go with the military route because it's something where A, if you serve the military, it's kind of writing what you know, and
mm,
B, it kind of like sets expectation with your audience about what the limitations of said training is. Like, what can they or can't they know what to do? And I think that's been there in the comics from the beginning. I mean, you had, all the original like golden age uh, artists and writers in comics, they all served at one point or another. Stan Lee, Jack
mm,
Kirby, you know, they've all served in the military at one point. And then you had heroes like Captain America. You had John Stewart, who was a Marine. Hal Jordan served in the Air Force. Like there's basically a long list of all these heroes who are veterans or currently serving in some cases, and that's what their background is. In order to show A, their skills, or B, their heroic sacrifice, or that they're willing to put themselves um, in their own safety above, you know, or not a, they're willing to save other people above their own risk and safety.
well, it's an idea of what you would be, as you were saying,
Sure.
because like if you're like of a certain age in the '60s, you would have served in World War II. There was an
Right.
understanding of someone who was like mid 30s, like mid 30s, early 40s would have been in World War II at that point. And then at the time when I was growing up, a lot of the characters in '80s shows or '80s movies, action shows had been in Vietnam
Right.
as well. Like you always that was sort of the
Well,
background,
that was
sort of the
that was the
background.
Punisher, and like, what is it? Martin Riggs and Murtaugh, both in Lethal Weapon, had both served in Vietnam, just under different circumstances. Like that was like the go-to. Like if you were in the '80s, you all served in Vietnam, or you were all in special operations, and you just didn't talk about uh, what you learned. Because even Martin Riggs was in a special unit that was hush hush and secret, and that's how you explain that Mel Gibson was a lethal weapon, while Murtaugh, who fought in the same war, was just a regular like beat detective who was too old for this shit, even though he was only just a couple years older than Mel Gibson at that point.
This is doing so. We're talking about engagement and your experience, and we've been meaning to talk about Wakanda Forever. What first off, what did you think of Wakanda Forever and
I
Namor?
thought it was good.
Namor.
It was they did the best that they could based on the real life situation that they could that they were put on, that they had to then adjust the plot for. I
Mm-hmm.
can see where the bare bones were there of what could have happened if T'Challa was the main character had Chadwick Boseman been around. Um, but think they did a really good job of adjusting to the circumstance and then writing a very compelling story about how does a kingdom or even a superhero world like the MCU deal with a figure such as T'Challa not being around anymore.
And the
Um,
consequences of his choice,
sure.
and the idea of Shuri, who was sort of this almost comic relief in the first film and light and essentially what had occurred. So you felt the weight of
Hmm.
both Thanos, but also the loss of her brother. So global and not certainly not, but small if it's one person's life.
Right.
That impact upon her through this film was sort of compelling. But the reason I kind of bringing that up in connection with what we've been discussing was because we've often talked about sort of the idea of quote unquote they're not essentially characters who are not essentially villains. They are actually engaging in ways that are perhaps not too dissimilar from how the the American military would behave or would act. And I just want to see if how, as given your experience, how fair that is, because I've had this discussion with others. So, um, leading off the fact that Namor is no more Namor. I'm going to keep calling him. I'm going to keep calling him the comic book name, unfortunately, and being
Yeah.
disrespectful to how he actually pronounces his name in the film because of 40 years of comics. But he does not. He does not actually. He does not actually start anything. It's essentially the American government and I think I think it's the Americans. When I saw it, invades and tries to take something from us, his
Yeah.
nation, right? Is that how it
It's
starts?
not.
Or
Well, it starts kind of. Well, it starts by the federal government. So T'Challa, prior to passing away, had opened up Wakanda and had let their secret known about who they are and what they have, and that they're not just this sheep sheep herders basically, which is what the rest of the world and the UN thought they were. So everyone now in the world knows about vibranium and they want vibranium, and that's where Queen Ramonda in the movie is wrestling with T'Challa's choice while at the same time dealing with the fact that for the entire reign where she was queen, with T'Chaka, they were a closed off nation. So she doesn't want to open up, but she's kind of like fulfilling her son's wishes and trying to live to that. But at the same time, letting the world know, like, you're not just going to come in here and just take our things. And that's the initial action that we're shown with the French invading the diplomatic outposts trying to steal vibranium. So the world governments are trying to find vibranium elsewhere. Okay, we can't we can't take it from the Wakandans. We can't invade their diplomatic outposts without risking war, even indirectly. So we're going to start looking elsewhere, and then we find a deposit of vibranium in the ocean. So they tried to mine that, and unfortunately, they don't know that there's a secret society of Talokan. So they didn't purposely look for a
yes,
conflict, but they kind of walked into one by invading Talokan, even accidentally, and then obviously
mm-hmm.
Namor and his forces being
Yeah.
protective, they basically expelled the invaders as harshly as possible, which is what the Wakandas would have done prior to T'Challa,
I
opening the
mean,
borders.
but
Anyone who invades Wakanda,
America would do that as well. Like
of
if
course,
someone, and you can't just, oh, I didn't know there's a country here where I'm trying to steal this oil from Texas or something. I
right,
mean, obviously it's a known entity, so you, generally speaking, it'd be very hard to plead ignorance if
right,
you're coming into Texas. But I don't know how much of a, like, I don't, yeah, they expel the people invading as harshly as possible, but not. So I guess that's the like a lot of what they do. How much of that of the of Neymar as people is like legitimate military engagement,
right.
even invading Wakanda, because I think they essentially declared war after certain terms, and
Yeah, well, the
we can
Wakanda
agree
thing
on the
was
currents.
yeah, the Wakanda thing was Namor trying to, after he's been invaded, realizing that the only way that he's gonna fully stop the surface word is to team up with the other isolated nation that has access to vibranium, and he tries to broker a treaty of sort, saying, "Hey, we're pretty alike. You're, a closed off society who is very protective of your, you know, vibranium and keeping your people safe and keeping this land pristine from invasion and colonization. We're the same thing. We're just in the oceans. Let's team up and be friends." And then, we got to murder this scientist who accidentally
Mm-hmm.
found this for us. And that's where the conflict with Shuri and the Wakandans are. They don't want to randomly murder a scientist. I think if Namor would have
Mm-hmm.
just been willing to say, okay, fine, don't murder the scientist, but can we team up and be friends? They would have, everything would have been fine. But their whole thing was, we're not going to risk that the scientist gave the government a way to find vibranium in the ocean. So we're going to murder the scientist outright. And then you're protecting the scientists. So now we're declaring war on you. And then
Mm-hmm.
that's where the escalation happened. And in the end, Queen Ramonda is dead. The scientist, Riri Williams is alive, but Queen Ramonda has died because of this, and they have a they have basically what Namor wanted from the beginning, which is an alliance after much bloodshed, but they have an alliance with Talakon, you know, for the future that we'll have to explore in,
Yeah.
future MCU movies. But in essence, Namor kind of got what he wanted. There's a lot of
Hmm.
bloodshed and fighting, but what he wanted was basically the alliance between these two nations in case, the rest of the world wants to go after vibranium. And that I'm sure will be explored in other movies. But that's where
And yeah,
that's
it's
that that's where the thing is with the villain having a realistic motivation, but when you look at it from the far enough view, realizing, yeah, the villain kind of got everything they wanted. Like this was a negotiation, but at the end of the day, like Shuri's the Black Panther, and M'Baku might be the king of Wakanda, or at least that's what's implied. And Ramonda's dead, but for the most part, like in the scoreboard, like Namor got everything he wanted. He's got
yeah.
the alliance, and everyone now knows how dangerous they are, including the rest of the world. So they might be more leery about going to Talakon looking for vibranium. So he got everything he wanted. The world is fearful of them, and they have an alliance. So the bad guy
No, no,
won.
no. He was very. I mean, it's much more, and he's a very compelling character. The actor
Mhm.
played him's great, and it's you know, one of the things they've argued that comics stories work better on serialized form in TV because you can, like in comics, course correct or leap on certain things. So if you watch the TV show Buffy, there's the idea of like, oh, this guy Spike is he's really kind of cool. Let's do more with him. We
Right.
thought this guy was going to be our main villain that season. He's actually annoying. We're going to get rid of him and concentrate on this guy. Maybe make Angel evil. You can kind of like respond to certain things that are happening. And I think it is interesting because I felt even before all the Jonathan Majors stuff started to happen, I was coming out of this thinking, well, the setup from Wakanda Forever, from Namor, and then sort of the state of the world at play felt more compelling to me for the springboard of an Avengers movie of the next one, where it's like sort of the surface world, and then versus and where Wakanda falls into that versus
Mhm.
Talakan is more compelling to me than whatever I'm being told about the Kang Dynasty, and especially like there's this weird thing of where your supposed next big bad is perhaps was in a critically panned and not as commercially successful film as most of the films released in the past few
Right.
years. And it was just like, okay, well, maybe there's a reason that we should back away. I was very surprised. I mean, you've seen Quantum Mania. I was just very
I have.
surprised at how it has. Whenever I've done writing workshops, it's always been the type of thing of like be creative, but also feel free to cheat off other people's papers, right? Like here's the things to
Right.
do. And
Right.
so here it's just like, oh, well, like your villain doesn't actually succeed in anything. Your hero does not actually do anything proactive. Um, there's no bloodshed. So if you think of most movies in in the Marvel Cinematic
Yeah.
Universe, someone has lost something. The villain has sort of drawn blood
Yeah.
that makes the villain compelling. And
Right.
so here, there's no villain. It's like he doesn't draw blood, he doesn't leave. And I had long since pitched the structure of it being where you start with your villain, Kang, needing something from the hero, puts him in a weak position. Because I'm like,
Right.
why does this guy need someone to get pimp? Like he's can't. He should be able to either figure out how to do it himself or whatever. I would have always flipped it where it's just some situation where either Hank is dying or whatever is dying or some and basically it's like Janet's like, okay, well, the only way to save him, we have to get this one thing. I know who has it. Bad news. Sort of the kind of heist where you have to go to hell
Sure.
and steal a teapot from the devil.
Right.
Devil doesn't really care about that teapot, but he doesn't really want you stealing from him.
Right.
And you might get away with the teapot, but you've pissed off the devil. And it's going to be, and you barely got out with your life with the teapot. So you could still win without minimizing the villain. The villain
Right.
remains a looming threat. Um, and I felt that might have ended things to more in a place of like, oh, well, now Kang is pissed, but he doesn't look like a chump. But
Right. So for me, the thing that stuck out with Quantum Mania from the beginning was that the main compelling thing about Ant Man is that it was a heist movie. It was comedic in tone, but it was also this playing around of like size between your hero and the real world. And this object would become big, but your hero would be extremely small, and then he would be extremely big, and then it's kind of hard to gauge the size of anything when everyone's in the quantum realm. Like even when he's a giant in the movie, like I mean, technically you're a giant, but in the quantum realm, so you're like still like super super tiny. You're just this weird fraction. Like I don't know how you regulate your size in with the technology so that you're ginormous, but in the quantum world versus just accidentally just making yourself giant and then being back in the real world and everyone else is stuck in the quantum realm.
mhm.
Um, and the thing is they were trying to do the heist thing, but the heist wasn't very compelling. I mean, it's just Janet made this thing really big, and we need you to somehow make it really small, and you need to risk yourself to do that. Like that's not much of a heist. The whole thing about
No,
Ocean's 11 or any type of heist movies that you go through this complex of like you have to pass this thing, and then you have to go through the lasers, and you have to turn off the power at just the exact
oh
moment.
yes,
And then he lost
and
his
that's yeah.
entire supporting cast. Where's Cassie's mom? Where's where's his entire crew of like thieves who help
Where's
him like
Cassie? We talked about Wakanda Forever recasting. You recast Cassie, and we're supposed to care, but that was always the risk. That the risk with recasting T'Challa had been, well, our relationship is not just a name. Our relationship is with Chadwick and that
right.
character, and you remove that and put it in. I mean, you could try to reestablish it. It's not impossible. They've done it
Who's a third
successfully.
Cassie?
Yeah, you've done it successfully with Don Cheadle and Mark Ruffalo, but those are very different situations. And how it was done here is like, here's this new lady, and we're not even going to really drive. And as I said, yeah, I mean, I loved heist. I love heist movies. Mission Impossible usually often has a big heist
Sure.
in them,
Yep.
and it is this idea of the hero has to do something literally impossible and things can go to hell and whatever. He doesn't have that format. It's just he goes, he gets it, and then the bad guy betrays him, which is less compelling than just him steal it. He has to steal the teapot from the devil. Here's how impossible it's going to be. We're going to, at constant
Right.
points, think he's not going to be able to do it. He gets it. Then there's a sort of confrontation where it literally is an ant versus, because you can really play that up. It's literally
Right.
an ant versus a giant. It's very hard to crush an ant, and sometimes and so maybe he gets out with his life and that's it. But ultimately it's about that heist with
Right.
King sort of looming over it. Would be probably more compelling to me, but that's, they decided not to go that way, decided to not do a compelling story with a compelling villain and a compelling supporting cast. And so now it's like, but next King, and that always seems strange to me. It's like you're watching, like, if you think of any Marvel film with done in one villains, it's like seeing Guardians of the Galaxy, and then at the end, the closing credits are for Ronan. It's like, well, isn't he dead? Ronan will
Right.
return. Like, I don't really care. Like, what? Like, he's dead and whatever. Like, you haven't. Like, he served his
I
purpose,
mean, they
right?
did
Like,
that. They did that with Thanos a little bit. You ended the Avengers movie, and you all of a sudden like dropped Thanos like right at the end. You had
but he,
him in like Guardians of
yeah.
the Galaxy as like as the person who sets Ronan up to go do his mission.
Mm-hmm.
But he essentially is not a non-character, and then he shows up. What is it in Avengers: Age of
Mm-hmm.
Ultron, where he just like randomly like breaks the
Grabs
fourth
the stuff.
wall to say,
I,
"I'll do it myself." But
what I defend about him in Guardians is that, and it comes up because I was watching it again for my kids, and it got
Mhm.
Guardians too, is that it's about his impact, which they don't do with Kang. His impact. So Thanos essentially is responsible for Drax losing his family. He is
Right.
responsible. We like Gamora. He did horrible things to Gamora, who we've learned to like. He did horrible, horrible things to Nebula. So that scene between Nebula and Gamora when she's describing what Thanos did to her, taking her brain out of her
Mm-hmm.
head, all this sort of stuff makes
Right.
us hate him, like think of him as a horrible person,
Sure.
and really we don't get an impact of what King has done to, and they sort of undercut. There's been tons of debate about MODOK, but I felt was undercutting of that was if you're spinning this on Cat, you even have Cassie make the joke about how she's referred to how a guy, not a wasp,
Yeah. The
but
B guy.
the
Like
big guy tried
yeah.
to kill her, and how traumatizing that would be, right? Like she's a little
Mm-hmm.
girl, and this guy, and then grotesquely dies in front of her. That should be traumatic.
Right.
And when he comes back and he's like all effed up, that should also be traumatic and serious. He could have played that well of him wanting revenge and her being horrified of him. And the sort of to ignore that tends to the idea of what again Guardians wound up showing in the third film and in all of their films, the idea that the comedy should sort of reflect character
Right.
rather than just sort of be snark, because then
Right.
snark just lessens stakes.
Mm-hmm.
And, my colleague Erin Brindley had taught me that. She's a great director, and I worked with her in Seattle. She's always like snark uh, minimizes stakes, and you learn so
Mm-hmm.
much, and it's much more from comedy that comes from character and from that moment. So, but
You
yes,
only have so
we
much
will see.
cachet with snark. Like Robert Downey Jr.'s Tony Stark gets away with it because the stakes are so high that his snark still doesn't manage to minimize the stakes. It's him basically trying to overcompensate for the fact that he's even with an armored suit, he's way above, you know, above his league on what he should be doing. Um,
Mhm. No,
but
yeah,
if
he
you
was
had to
sort
do
of
that and he
it
was just
works.
totally powerful and there was no risk to it, then yeah, it becomes this thing where then why are we putting stakes in this if you don't care?
Exactly. Well, we shall see. I mean, I was waiting for the. I liked the first season of Loki. People have talked about recasting Kang. The issue is so much of what has been the best thing about Kang so far has been Majors. So I don't
Mhm.
know. It's not like so far. It's not like oh, this is such a great character that I feel like give another person a chance.
Yeah,
It's more of like okay, well, the last episode of Loki would have been a pretty dull exposition bomb, but Majors made it compelling
yep,
that it was more Majors' performance than what happened. But we'll see. Uh, it seems inevitable that there'll be a recast, or I would hope they just go in a different direction.
yeah.
Maybe do the Namor and
I mean, it just seems like
Wakanda thing.
with with the previous phases, there was this sense of like we're gonna do these individual movies, and then there's a MacGuffin here that might eventually tie to the Infinity Gauntlet, um, or but we're not spending our time like chasing the Infinity Gauntlets. They just happen to show up, and then like that's the MacGuffin, and that's what we're dealing with. This multiverse saga seems like we're trying to purposely chase going into the
Mhm.
multiverse, while at the same time doing this thing where there's movies that like are totally going to be divorced from it, and like the next Captain America movie, from what I've read and seen, like I don't see how that would in any way connect to anything with multiverse at all, which is fine. Same thing with like Thunderbolts and some of these other things. It's like it's fine if it's not connected, but I would much rather everything not be connected instead of you telling me that there's this
Sure.
multiverse saga and everything is connected when you know it's not. You know,
Mhm. No, my other concern is the multiverse will sort of or Kang will be used to sort of smooth out building conflicts. So if the Cap film New World Order is sort of furthering stuff from the Falcon and Winter Soldier show, and then what we saw at the end of Wakanda Forever, so the geopolitical stuff that's very compelling, then you bring in literal universe is at stake, so let's all shake hands and fight the bigger issue and ignore all this stuff would
hmm
be less compelling to me because I feel like that the geopolitical stuff is what is compelling.
and I think that's where
Um,
they're going with like Thunderbolts and Captain America and New World Order. It seems like, and again, I'm reading like the rumors, so you know, where there's no for sure about where they're going, but it seems like the Captain America stuff is going connected to the Thunderbolt stuff. It's connected to how the world is reacting to, you know, what everything that's happened with the superheroes and with Wakanda, and then I guess they're gonna finally address what's going on with the Eternals, or at least with this giant frozen celestial in the middle of the ocean in the Eternals, or at least that's the rumor that I read. I don't know if you read that, but
Yeah,
what I
we'll
read is that
see.
they're all going to be fighting to because they've discovered adamantium. Which hey, now we're not going to start bringing that stuff in. Um, they've discovered adamantium in the body of the Celestial, so now it's all the world's trying to take that instead of vibranium, and it's the conflict of different governments, and apparently the new Captain America movie is going to also be like pseudo sequel to the Incredible Hulk because you've got Liv Tyler and you've got all these people, and you got Samuel Stearns from the or the leader from the Incredible Hulk movie. So they're picking up all these threads they just left behind in that Universal movie, in a Captain America movie, which continues to like connect Hulk with Captain America Super Soldier program in a weird yet somewhat interesting way.
Yes. Well, you're certainly to draw this, I guess, to a close. We get to time. You're sort of the Cap, right? You
Yeah,
having served or whatever,
yeah.
you're a soldier, and
Didn't have secret
yeah.
steroids though. That would have changed the game and would have made things a lot easier.
But we are very fortunate. You are still, you served, but you are with us now, and doing great work for us. And you can check out Michael does the Sunday show roundup for us that appears every Monday at Wonkette, and we will probably talk some more about media, but other things related to, I think, stuff that's going on in your neck of the woods. Not entirely Florida anymore, but Ron DeSantis is running for president, so that will be certainly your
I've
take on that
certainly
will be
written about
fascinating.
Ron DeSantis and the whole Disney battle recently too. So there's also that. Ron DeSantis he's the only person I've seen where their presidential run has completely petered out and died before they've even made an announcement. Even Rudy Giuliani in like what was it? He ran in
8.
2008. Like he still had like momentum as he was like announcing.
Mm-hmm.
He made all these strategic mistakes where he ignored everywhere but Florida and thought that just winning Florida would just propel him forward, and then he lost
Yeah.
terribly. But like Ron DeSantis has somehow like done all the pre stuff, and everyone who's met him has basically just said no, thank you.
Yeah, well, all the Republicans seem to be under this idea that Trump would coup only once and would apparently only deny elections he loses to Joe Biden. But that's actually not what will happen. It is
He's
that
literally
if
saying that he's going to do everything all over again,
he
and he's going to
will,
pardon everyone from the
but like,
insurrection.
there's no way he's either going to win straight out and humiliate DeSantis,
Mm-hmm.
or if DeSantis were to win, he would rain hell on the Republican Party, which is certainly to Democrats' benefit. So, well, thank you, Michael, for joining us. We will remember to like, share, subscribe. You can find me, the Play Typer Guy, on YouTube, and this podcast will be on iTunes and Spotify and all those other places. And you can find Michael at Twitter as well. I'll have a link there, and catch you soon. Take care. Bye bye.